We are going to read from chapter 2 of Ruth. If any of you want to follow along in the Bible, it's page 211 in your pew Bibles. Now Naomi had a kinsman on her husband's side, a prominent rich man of the family of Elimelech, whose name was Boaz. And Ruth the Moabite said to Naomi, "Let me go to the field and glean among the ears of grain behind someone in whose sight I may find favor." She said to her, "Go, my daughter." So Ruth went. She came and gleaned in the field behind the reapers. As it happened, she came to a part of the field belonging to Boaz, who was of the family of Elimelech. Just then Boaz came from Bethlehem. He said to the reapers, "The Lord be with you." And they answered, "The Lord bless you." Then Boaz said to his servant who was in charge of the reapers, "To whom does this young woman belong?" The servant who was in charge of the reapers answered, "She is the Moabite who came back with Naomi from the country of Moab. She said, 'Let me glean and gather among the sheaves behind the reapers.' So she came, and she's been on her feet from early this morning until now, without resting for even a moment." Then Boaz said to Ruth, "Now listen, my daughter. Do not go to glean in another field or leave this one, but keep close to my young women. Keep your eyes on the field that is being reaped and follow behind them. I have ordered the young men not to bother you. If you get thirsty, go to the vessels and drink from what the young men have drawn." Then she fell prostrate with her face to the ground and said to him, "Why have I found favor in your sight, that you should take notice of me when I am a foreigner?" But Boaz answered her, "All you have done for your mother-in-law since the death of your husband has been fully told me, how you've left your father and mother in your native land and came to a people that you did not know before. May the Lord reward you for your deeds, and may you have a full reward from the Lord, the God of Israel, under whose wings you've come for refuge." And then she said, "May I continue to find favor in your sight, my Lord, for you've comforted me and spoken kindly to your servant, even though I'm not one of your servants." The word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. Please be seated. This little tiny book, Ruth, follows two rather violent and large books of the Bible, Joshua and Judges. In Joshua, we have the young man who took over for Moses and led the people into the promised land when Moses could not. And honestly, Joshua is filled with a lot of war and essentially genocide. In the book of Judges, you have the people finally settled in the promised land. And when neighbors start to attack, the people cry out to God, and God sends a judge, a military and spiritual leader like Samson and Deborah and Gideon. And then you have this little book, Ruth, named after a woman who isn't even a Jew. She's a Moabite. And yet in this little story, she shows great faith, devotion, and kindness, essentially saving the life of her mother-in-law, Naomi. As you may remember, being a widow in this time was really a very awful judgment to have to live through. It left you completely vulnerable. Naomi, losing her husband and then her two sons, had instantly become a burden. Yet Ruth did not leave her. Ruth and Naomi together returned to Bethlehem to see how they could survive. Ruth enters into the unknown with Naomi. Now, in this time in Israel, there was a law that landowners would leave a portion of their field unharvested so that the poor could come and glean. It was a way for the people of Israel to be socially responsible and to take care of those who were in situations of great need. Ruth and Naomi were in a situation by means they couldn't control through no fault of their own, and yes, they were in great need. So Ruth gleans Boaz's field. He notices her, offers protection, telling her that she can come to his field and get all that she needs. And as it so happened, Naomi begins to do some serious matchmaking, and by the end of the book, Ruth and Boaz are married. Naomi actually becomes very important to the story. And of course, Ruth is important to the story. Boaz is important to the story. As many of you know, as I've mentioned, it is World Food Sunday today, a day in which we will take a special offering for ELCA World Hunger. And many of us know that there are millions of people in poverty around the world for various reasons: war, poor government, famines, drought, lack of access to clean water. All of these create conditions where families struggle greatly. What I love about ELCA World Hunger is that it lifts people out of poverty in two ways. First, it addresses the immediate need that might be there for clean water and food and shelter in a difficult time. But then they work for long-term solutions. They bring in healthcare, they bring in education, they bring in long-term sustainable development for families and communities to lift them all together out of poverty and into the life in which they would like. Now, many of us understand that there are conditions in this world, circumstances that would put people in poverty. But within our own country, we often have a very negative mindset towards the poor, towards refugees, towards different people. We believe in our country that you can be anything, that the playing field is perfectly even. And so anyone who's poor in this country obviously hasn't worked hard enough, right? We hear and perpetuate stories of poor people taking advantage of the system. We create shame around the subject of hunger and poverty because really, we're afraid. You see, in our lifetimes, we wear a mask that's composed of what gender we are, our personality, our ethnicity, our social status, our job. It's not really who we are. As we live life, we often believe the mask, that is who we actually are, and we forget the bigger picture. We forget who we are, that we are connected to one another, and we forget how close God really is in our lives. We become convinced that God is just pushed up away in the heavens, and we stratify humans into different sections until we all feel separate and really rather alone. And when we feel alone, we buy into fear. I think that often when we see someone who's homeless, someone asking for money on the street, or when we hear about families that need to go on welfare or have low-income housing, when we see pictures of people with no food in their fridge, secretly we're afraid. We are unconsciously terrified that that could be us. That if the right circumstance came along, that if a job was lost, if our upbringing had been different, if a diagnosis was given, if a key family member died, if the market crashed, all our efforts to be self-sufficient and responsible and an island would give away, and we would find ourselves needing help. Isn't that one of the worst things we can imagine? Needing help, relying on others, having to ask for help. So I believe we pass around and believe stories about homeless and the poor, stories that they did something to deserve their fate, that they're bad people, that they're lazy and greedy and selfish, and then we feel better because we aren't them. We have separated ourselves from them, and it isn't our problem. They are they, and we are we. But that is a lie. A lie created out of fear, and fear taints reality. Reality is more complex and more gray and more interconnected. Reality presents a world we cannot control, a world in where things do change all the time as much as we try to keep it the same, where our carefully laid plans may just disintegrate in our hands, where we discover that within ourselves we contain both amazing beauty and goodness, as well as great destruction and darkness. You and I are both hardworking and lazy. We are both wise and foolish. We are both generous and greedy. Usually we'll nourish one of those traits so those traits will become dominant, but both lie inside of all of us. In my original sermon that I had written up this week, I had pages of statistics and numbers about the poor and SNAP to prove that what you hear on the news is a warped version of reality. But it didn't feel right. It wasn't so much a sermon as just a really good lecture on the reality of poverty in our world and our country and the lies we often tell ourselves. Instead, what I want you to hear today in your soul is that often what we perceive as true isn't. The truth is we all need each other. We all need help sometimes. And we are all of the exact same value in the eyes of God, and we all depend on each other. We are not islands, but strands of a web, so that if one side pulls, the others stretch. You see, Naomi was under the illusion that she was worthless, that she was this little island all by herself. But Ruth saw her value. And then Ruth was under the impression that she was forgettable, but Boaz saw her value. And maybe Boaz thought that he was some big important man because of his money and his land and his status. But he actually wasn't important until he had compassion for Naomi and Ruth. And this is the interesting thing. Boaz wouldn't have made it in the Bible. He wouldn't have been remembered 3,000 years later because of his money or wise big business practices. Boaz is remembered because of his kindness and his relationship and his family. So God calls us to care for each other the way that Ruth and Naomi and Boaz cared for each other. God asks us to stop seeing each other out of fear and black and white assertions, as if we can lump people into categories and dismiss them. That isn't how we are called to see the world. The world is complex, things are not always fair, and people are all a mixture of good and bad, compassionate and selfish, lazy and hardworking. We all are. And we're called to err on the side of helping people, of being compassionate and opening our hearts to others. So today I'm going to ask you to do just one thing to help end hunger. In the very middle of the bulletin, I add a little box of what can you do to end hunger. And I gave you 6 options. Of course, today during the hymn of the day, I know it says during the offering, but it's going to be during the hymn of the day, we'll invite you to come forward and put something in our basket for ELCA World Hunger. But this is something relatively new, something that I've begun to do. There are forms downstairs on the ELCA World Hunger table where you can join and be a monthly partner. For as little as $10 a month and going up to as much as you want, you can have a monthly withdrawal taken out of your account to give to ELCA World Hunger. But there are also good gifts catalogs, and I have started giving for Christmas presents to my nieces and nephews some of the sweet little animals in here, rather than another toy that they don't need. But not just Christmas, birthdays, anniversaries, all sorts of gifts that can be given from the Good Gifts catalog. But I also encourage you to educate yourself a little bit, to stop and to actually listen to stories of people who are going through a difficult time, and to open your heart and see the complexity of their lives. And finally, I encourage you to be a stigma stopper. That when people say black and white assertions, when people speak to those people out of fear, that you would stop them and not let those kind of comments continue, but encourage a dialogue and openness, learning, and compassion. I know this is serious stuff, and I know our lives get so busy, and it's hard to think about big issues like hunger and poverty. In fact, we already know it's so complex that it can feel overwhelming to take the first step. I totally understand. As Christians, though, we gather as a community to figure this life out together. And it is my call as a pastor to help you to do this, to help you care for the poor. That is why we have one Sunday a year to learn a bit more, to do a bit more, to grow a bit more as a faithful community. God invites us to see the value in all people just as God sees the value in you. And remember, we're all connected. We're all in this together. Amen.